I'm gonna tell it anyway, although the circumstances just changed. The first time I did one of these in front of a really decent-sized group was at Plain Talk down in New Orleans. And if you ever sit in it, so I got to the room early, and when you sit in front of an empty room and you're watching the time click by and you know you're early, you're just hoping, just please God, somebody show up. And you have this number in your head, like 3 people. 3 people would be okay. And then more and more people came, and then the room was packed. I looked out at the room and I said, you know, Louisa Moats is right down the hall. What are you doing here? It sort of blew me away. Let me ask first, how many of you sort of kind of know me in that social media way from like Spell Talk? All right. Yeah, no. See, my wife was really worried about that. So the first thing you have to do is really temper your expectations. We're going to try to talk about some things and hopefully convey some important knowledge. As a little bit of a background, so one of the things I need to always start by saying is I'm a little bit of an unusual presenter at these things. I am not a reading researcher. I've never taught anybody to read. I don't work in an academic department that has anything to do with reading. I don't work for a school. You're going to find out in the course of my presentation what I do for my living and how it ends up that I am here today. So our presentation is titled, A Developmental Model of Trauma Growth and Resilience, the Place for Language and Reading. Over the course of my career as a psychologist in Milwaukee County, I've assessed conservatively 6,000 children, and I walked into the office of people who worked for me one day. We work not exclusively but heavily with the deeper end of the pool, the more complex cases. Many of the folks we work with are from lower socioeconomic status. And I just blurted out one day out of frustration, what percentage of our kids do you think read halfway decent? They all looked at me like I was an idiot, and then the first one to speak said, well, none. Why are you asking? And this was an extraordinarily neglected thing, obviously, in the lives of our children. For those of you familiar with 1980s pop music, you'll recognize this line. In the passage from the cradle to the grave, we are born madly dancing. And everything that happens in our life makes that dance a little better or makes that dance a little harder, makes us dance a little easier and more gracefully, or trips us and causes us to stumble. When I talk about development, when I refer to development, first, how many of you have children? How many of you have more than one child? I have 3. I would ask for like how many had 3, but then we'd have to raise 3 hands and that gets awkward. How many of you have seen more than one child in the course of your life? I ask that question to rooms full of police officers, and they are the most suspicious people in the world. They don't raise their hands because they think like I'm tricking them. My point is we all have some familiarity with children. We all have some sense of what it means to grow up. When I talk about development, I'm talking about something more than growing up. I'm talking about something more than going from being an infant to being a toddler to being a school-age child to being an adolescent. God help you if you have any adolescents at home. To eventually being some form of an adult, and then we continue to develop beyond that. I'm talking about more than the simple act of getting bigger, of having more experiences. I'm talking about a deeper, more profound experience of how we change and grow and are prepared over time. That's my continuum, by the way, from infancy to late adolescence and early adulthood. That someplace in here, children reach an extraordinarily important moment in their life. A moment in their life which really in many ways decides, which says something, is a referendum on their life until this point, but which is also sets them up or sets them back in their effort to move on with the rest of their life. And so as we talk about this, I want to go over some little basic fundamentals of development. You all know these things. Whether you know these things in these terms or not, I'm not sure. But there's lots of things we know that bear repeating. There's lots of things we know that bear periodically review, that we take them from the back of our mind and carry them into the front of our mind. Lots of things that bear some attention from time to time. The most important thing children need starting out in life is safety and security. Now, safety and security doesn't mean armed guards or being protected simply from physical harm. For infants, safety and security means being loved, being held, being nurtured, being taken care of. That when you cry, someone comes to you most of the time. When you're hungry, somebody feeds you most of the time. When you need something, somebody comes to you. The world comes to you. People you get to know come to you and care for you and nurture you and do what you need. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin. The most important research study ever done in the state of Wisconsin was done on this subject. How many of you, if I said wire and cloth mothers, would know what I was talking about? See, there was a time that everybody's hand would have gone up. There was a research study done in the psychology department at the University of Wisconsin that showed that if you deprived monkeys, rhesus monkeys, not even like really sophisticated monkeys, if you deprived monkeys of touch, of warmth, of movement, of somebody who held them and cared for them and nurtured them and pulled them close, somebody they could cling to, it had devastating impacts on the rest of their life. And certainly we know that children who are denied these things suffer devastating consequences. But even for children who get this, for children who get this well enough, and that's most children, there are more things that come along that they need to get. And if they don't get them, they suffer dramatically. One of those things is language. How many of you remember, even if you don't remember the word, how many remember the excitement of your children speaking their first word? And before that, whether you remember it as clearly or not, you remember when your children seemed to recognize words, when they seemed to respond to words. You could say, "Where's the dog?" and they'd look at the dog. "Where's Jimmy?" and they'd look at Jimmy. You could say, "Where's Susie?" and they'd look at you like you were crazy because there was no Susie. They recognized that you were messing with them. Children are, just as with safety and security, they have a deep biological evolved need to develop language, to be exposed to language, to drink in language, and to reflect it back to us. I had a woman I was talking to about this, and I talked about the idea of how excited we get over a child's first words. She came up to me afterwards, she says, "My daughter spoke her first words at 6 months of age." And I was immediately very, very skeptical. Lots of people believe that. And then the next one came and she said flamingo. And I thought, no. But I smiled, no. But this is the excitement we have. My child is speaking. Because not only does it connect them to us and give us excitement about what's coming, it reassures us that everything's going okay. And the lives of parents whose children reach 12 months and 14 months and 15 months and 18 months and 20 and 24 months and are not speaking. And the fear that comes from that, the disinterest in language, how devastating that is, because that implies that something deep and essential to our humanity isn't coming online, that it isn't coming to fruition. Along with safety, language, and safety, security, and language, there are relationships. I cannot stress strongly enough how essential it is to our very nature to have relationships. Those wire and cloth monkeys, when they grew up, those babies who were raised that way, all struggled with relationships. They actually became a model of rhesus monkey juvenile delinquency. They couldn't function. They couldn't function with other monkeys. They couldn't be left together with them. In the next generation, when they had their own offspring, they failed as parents because they had been denied this opportunity to form critical, important relationships. And as we get into this, one of the things we're going to see is that safety, security, language, and relationships have reciprocal relationships with each other. If you have a basic sense of safety and security in infancy, and later on it starts to be threatened for some reason, sometimes what threatens it is difficulty with language or difficulty with relationships. And sometimes if it is threatened, one of the things that can buttress it, that can reinforce it, that can help to sustain it against damage and give it a chance to heal is the access to language and relationships. These are three highly evolved things which together establish the foundation and the basis for early, healthy, successful development in human children. They all have a neurological basis. Trauma, something which gets talked about a lot nowadays, trauma threatens not only our sense of safety and security, but our ability to develop language and develop and sustain relationships. Children who suffer extensive trauma early enough have measurably smaller brains and areas of their brains. They have a smaller corpus callosum, so they have less interaction going from the left side of their brain to the right side of their brain. They show inefficient organization in the brain. Things which should be done efficiently and in an organized fashion are done in ways as though the brain isn't sure what to do, in a confused sort of manner. We see, relatively speaking, and I want to say something about this, an overuse of the right hemisphere. You know, sometimes when we talk about, it was very intimidating. I did some of this presentation in South Carolina about a year and a half ago, and Marianne Wolf was sitting in the right front row, and I thought, I'm going to talk about like brains, and Marianne Wolf is sitting like that far away. And I sort of looked at her like several times, am I doing okay? And she'd be like, yeah, you know, she'd make these faces, and I was like, holy crap. But the big message I want to give you is that some of the things you see about brain organization that show these kinds of gray brains with little lit up areas that imply to you that the rest of your brain isn't doing anything, and just these one or two areas are working. What those are showing you is little differences between different kinds of brains in terms of where different kinds of energy and effort are being extended, where activity is higher or lower. But the fact of the matter is, virtually all your brain is working virtually all the time. And to see these differences is a very complex thing. And there is a tendency in the brains of children who have sustained significant repeated psychosocial trauma to show a little more activity on the right side than they do on the left compared to other children. We see an underuse of frontal lobes. This is sometimes misrepresented in sort of overly dramatic terms, that these children's brains have been hijacked by their brainstem. You know, you have this idea of like a brainstem with a handgun or an AK-47, like hijacking the rest of the brain. That's not what's happening. But there is a shift of activity away from more sophisticated, more advanced, more highly developed thinking areas of the brain. And the balance, the tension and the balance in the brain between those areas and what we might crudely refer to as older, more primitive areas of the brain shifts, and those older, more primitive areas seem to exert more influence over what's going on. The response to trauma reflects a deeply evolved need. It reflects this deeply evolved need for safety and security, an overwhelming need to return to a sense of safety and security. The neurological basis of language is well understood. I'm not talking about reading here. One purpose of language, one thing that we see in children as they develop language, is it changes the way their brain is organized. It serves to organize the brain. Our brains are waiting for language. When language arrives, we see different patterns of development. We see different parts of the brain working in different ways, different connections being formed. We see the brain favoring certain patterns of organization and certain connections in the brain over others. It promotes a little bit, this is a small bias, it promotes a little bit of a left hemisphere bias. These critical areas involved in language are more on the left side of the brain, and we see this left hemisphere bias. That's a good thing. It enlarges the corpus callosum. It promotes and builds frontal lobe activity. All the thinking that goes along with language. You see a marked comparison here between the effects of trauma and the effects of language. That the developed language and language skill does certain things to the brain, and we know that trauma tends to do, in many cases, what appears to be exactly the opposite things to the developing brain. It generates efficiency. Brains get good at things. A brain that's good at language does language efficiently. And it again reflects this deeply evolved need to develop language. Language is this, as you all know, is this highly evolved thing that human beings are deeply evolved to have. We are not the only animals that have language, but we have far and away the most deeply developed and evolved system of language. That's an interesting thing. Somebody tried to get in an argument that other animals don't have language, so I have to tell this story. Researchers, this is a great one. Researchers were studying monkeys in the South Pacific on an island, and they had observed monkeys that had developed a word that meant, the sound that meant, they fed down on the ground, that meant a leopard is coming, run. And they recorded it, and they could play it. When monkeys were feeding on the ground, they could play it over a speaker, and all the monkeys would run up into the trees and look for the leopard. And then they learned there was another monkey in the area that had learned to say, there's a leopard coming, run, even when there wasn't a leopard, and it would stick around and would eat all the food and have all the food to itself. True story. So we are not the only animals that have language. We are not, but we have a far more sophisticated language. For instance, those monkeys were limited in their ability to come back and curse out the other monkey. Humans, on the other hand, could be, even at a young age, really skilled at telling that other monkey what they thought about that decision. Relationships. When we have relationships with other human beings, when we engage with other human beings in close social relationships, it enhances and builds the connectivity in the brain. Your brain lays down millions and millions, just as it does with language, millions and millions of new neural connections during the day. Then at night, when you're sleeping, it pairs some back, and then it lays some new ones down. Relationships and social interaction are a major contributor to the neural networks that the brain is developing throughout your life, but particularly in childhood. Relationships promote language. It seems to be the simplest thing in the world, but we have to remind people of it. Relationships promote language, particularly before you start to read and you're engaged in oral language. You engage in oral language with other people. If you don't have relationships with anybody, you're in a room talking to yourself. And that's a whole other problem. Children will, one of the benefits, it's perfectly normal, one of the benefits of children developing make-believe friends, imaginary friends, is it gives them a chance to have a social, language-based relationship with if you've ever walked past a room of a child, often a girl, who's got 2 or 3 imaginary friends in there, she can be having a fabulous conversation with them. This is a good thing. Up to a certain age, this is a really good thing. And I have seen children deprived of normal, healthy relationships who continue to sustain themselves with imaginary friends and imaginary relationships for all the benefits they try to derive from that. Relationships soothe the brain. We know that children who have been traumatized, who are under enormous stress, who show all the neural indicators of stress and trauma and panic, can be soothed just by the presence of a human being with whom they have some degree of relationship. They don't even have to say anything, they just have to draw close, and it's soothing to them. And it's probably true, and anthropologists will tell us, that our complex social drive is probably the cause of our huge brains. The complexity of our social interaction and the language that grows from it is probably the reason our brains are so freaking large. And we're born with these enormous heads. I say to a room full of women, many of whom have given birth. You know, when children are born, remember they have that soft spot on the top of their head. The reason for that is your skull actually grows from a group of bones that are growing during fetal development and trying to reach each other and form a skull. And the whole time they're growing towards each other, your brain is pushing them all away from each other. So they can never quite get there. The reason you have a forehead is because your bones are trying to grow backwards and your brain is shoving them out. And part of your brain actually curls around underneath because it runs into the front of your brain and it has to roll around underneath itself. Our brains are enormous in their size and complexity. And one of the great benefits of that, and one of the drives behind that, is this complex social drive. The default network refers to an observation by some neurologists and behaviorists who believe, and I think there's a lot of truth in it, that our brain at its default, when it has nothing else to do, will think about and review and plan for and hypothesize for and make up social interactions that it practices in its head. If you think about it, if you have nothing else to do and your mind is quiet, you think about what you did during the day, how you interacted with people during the day, how it might go next time, what you would have done if you had won the billion-dollar jackpot. These are the things we think about. We think about these social things. We are wired to do that more than anything else. And these relationships are closely linked to safety and survival. We cannot survive alone. We are not designed to survive alone. And the interaction between these things is undeniable in our development. I want to pause for a moment now and I'm going to tell you several stories while I'm up here today. And I want to explain the purpose of these stories is to illustrate some things, not to kind of wow you with these. These are all true stories about real people, and I have to be careful how much of their stories I tell. So the first story I want to tell you is about a 16-year-old girl from rural Wisconsin. She lived in a small to medium-sized town that I had never been to before, but she landed on my front porch, more or less, professionally speaking, when she tried to kill herself in her small town and had to be picked up by a helicopter and flown to Milwaukee, where I work. And I was called to come over to the Children's Hospital from the county's Behavioral Health Division to help sort out the rather complex medical legal consequences of doing that. So there was some legal paperwork on her that was filed in Milwaukee County, even though she was a resident of a different county. And the paperwork said that even when she was medically well, she couldn't go, that we were very worried about her condition because she had made this very serious suicide attempt. So I walked into her room with my piece of legal paper in tow to explain what I was going to do there. She was lying in a bed. I do these kinds of things quite often. And part of what was different about it was she had people there with her. A lot of times these kids are alone. They're stunningly alone. She was 16 years old. She was a tiny little thing. There's something about laying in a hospital bed that makes you look even smaller. But her mother was there, and so was her older sister, who had left college to come to join the two of them and show her support and her love for her sister. And I came in and I talked to them about what had happened, and she explained to me what she had done, and I read her the police report, and she said, yeah, the police report was about right. And I got around to the big question, which I asked in a very careful way. I said, what brought you to all this? What's been going on in your life? And she explained to me that about a year and a half earlier, her parents had separated and were now divorced because it turned out they were both having affairs. This was devastating to her and her relationships to her family. And she responded to that. She felt she couldn't go with either one of them, so she left she became estranged from her parents, started staying with friends, sofa hopping, couch surfing, staying one place or another for days or weeks at a time and going to another one. I put her at some pretty extreme risk for some other things to happen. In fact, in the year and a half since she had been couch surfing, she had been sexually assaulted twice. The second time by a very popular boy from her high school who was a star athlete, and when she reported him to the police, he was arrested, and while charges were pending, he was not allowed to play on sports teams. That caused her to be an outcast at her high school, where she was bullied and ostracized, at least by the students, and she said also by the faculty and staff. These were remarkable conversations. They're always remarkable conversations. These are children I have met only minutes before. And as we talked about these things with her mother and her sister there, they confirmed everything she said, and one thing stood out to me, and that was none of this explained why she had tried to kill herself. She talked about this stuff like it was nothing. She didn't cry, they didn't cry. There was very little emotion. So I asked the question I've learned to ask over the years that usually comes later in the interview, and I have a certain way I ask it. I looked at her and I said, back when you started school, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, how did it go? And there was a pause and nobody said anything. So I followed it with my follow-up question that always follows the pause. Was there something that was harder than everything else? Maybe math or reading. When I said reading, her mother looked at the floor and her sister looked out the window. And the girl looked me dead in the eyes and she said, I can't read. I've never been able to read. And her mother started to cry and her sister started to weep. And they both started to reach for tissues in the room. This girl who had just told me moments ago about being raped twice, about being estranged from her family and sleeping for a year and a half on various couches, and done so with little or no emotion, talking about being unable to read, brought her sister and her mother to sobbing tears. Her sister, sitting by the window, through choking back tears, recounted to me trying to help her sister read when she was little and the struggles she would have and how difficult it was and how they would take turns in the family working with her because it was so hard, it was so emotional, it was so painful to work with her. This was a girl who had a sense of safety and security in the world, who had relationships, who had love, who had caring, who in spite of the divorce still felt loved and cared for by her family. And yet the devastation that was brought upon her by her inability to read, and it was deep and profound. When she said she couldn't read, she didn't mean she read poorly. She meant she could not read. Drove her to the point that she was willing to try to kill herself. And as she said to me, being raped, I know I'll put that behind me someday. And someday I'll make up with my parents, and I'll come back to them, and I'll come back to my family. But not being able to read, that's every day. That's going to be there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after. As a little aside, I called her high school in her small town, and I asked to speak to whoever was in charge of reading, and I asked if she knew that she struggled so much with reading, and she said, no, we had no idea. And I said, just in my brief evaluation of her, I was stunned that a girl that age could struggle as much with phoneme awareness as she did. And the reading specialist said, "What's phoneme awareness?" And I tried to explain it to her, and she says, "Yeah, we don't do anything with that." I said, "Yeah, I figured that out." This was the quote from Matthew Lieberman. "Evolution has made a bet that the best thing for a brain to do in any spare moment is to get ready for what comes next in social terms." That's how incredibly important social relationships are to us. Now I'm going to try in a really clumsy way to illustrate for you what I think this looks like and where I think this all plays in development. I want you to imagine a foundation to human development that is based on safety and security. And then formed with that are two pillars, which are relationships and language. It's only language if this button works, otherwise there's nothing there. And together, these three things, if you have them good enough, give you a chance to accumulate other things. I'm not suggesting that children who have safety and security and relationships and language are home free. I'm not suggesting that in any way, shape, or form. But I am suggesting that if you have these things, you have a start on other things. You have a chance to make some other things happen. Relationships have a deep association between safety and security. If you have a sense of relationship in your world, if you are connected to other people, if those people are loving and caring towards you, that helps to maintain that sense of safety and security over time. To feel safe and secure as an infant means to be fed and held and clothed and not much more than that. But as you get older, that sense of safety and security becomes a lot more sophisticated, a lot more nuanced, and much of that flows from relationships. It's also true that language contributes to safety and security. How do we reassure ourselves? How do others reassure us? How do we have confidence in our own life without the use of language, both in our own head and in what we share with other people? And certainly, relationships and language have this close tie between them. If you have all that and all that's working, you now have a chance to accumulate other things. You can develop hopes and dreams and interests and experiences and talents and knowledge and everything you can use to build a life. If we go back over early development, and you have half a chance to feel a sense of safety and security, and you build the skills necessary and have some success in early relationships, you build language and you're good enough at language, now you get into a stage of your life as school begins where you have a chance to start accumulating hopes and dreams and interests, experiences. You just get to find out what you're good at and what you're bad at. And all those glorious years that we all remember so warmly before adolescence stepped in and made life complicated. Those years when summer seemed to go on forever and every snowfall was the kind you could make snowballs and snowmen out of. That's what you remember if you're from the north. I don't know where the rest of you are from. And life seems magical. During those years that you figure out who you are, you find out what you're good at, you find out what it means to fail and pick yourself back up again, all within the safe context of a safe and secure world built on relationships and ever important language that gives you a chance to do all these things. If you don't have a sense of safety and security, if you lack for relationships, if you are poor at language, and the people around you are poor at language, your ability to accumulate this list of good things, to accumulate these things from which you build a life, is dramatically limited. I see children who have never played off their own porch. They live in neighborhoods that are so dangerous that they never have it, that they are not allowed to leave their own front yards. I know children who reach their middle teens and have never played with anybody except siblings and cousins. I know children who rarely engage in language except with a handful of people in the world, and most of that language is based around basic needs of living and the enforcement of rules, many of which have to do with safety. I know children who come from such poverty and such chaos and disorganization that daycare for them for many years was to be put in. Two of the children were put in one room, two of the children were put in another room across the hall from each other, and a series of shoelaces tied together tied the doorknobs of the room to each other so that they were pulled together and couldn't be opened. It is the lack of relationships, the lack of language, the lack of those things, and the lack of the opportunity to repeat those things the millions and millions and millions of times that we need to in order to get good at them. How many of you know what I'm talking about when I say the word gap? Everybody knows the word gap. Everybody knows this important study done by Hart and Risley. It said that poor kids from more stressed and chaotic and impoverished backgrounds, arrived at school having heard millions fewer words than other children did, and the words they heard tended to be simpler, they tended to be organized in less interesting and sophisticated ways. The word gap isn't just the word gap. The word gap also reflects the relationship gap. They've had fewer relationships. Those relationships have been less interesting. They've been less intricate, less rewarding, less fulfilling. And those children, because they have less language, and they have fewer and less rich relationships, have a less developed sense of safety and security, which is easier to threaten, more fragile, more brittle. Reading is a technology which expands the evolved basis of language beyond the immediate environment and lets it reach other times, places, and people. It allows us to be in relationship with people we have never met, to consider the motivations of characters who never existed except on paper, to learn about places and things we have never seen, and to exercise the deepest mental skills, and this is what's so critically important, at our own pace, in our own time, according to our own needs. Until there was writing and therefore reading, I could tell you about what I thought of the world, but I had to be there with you to do it. And you had to hear me when I was there and ready to tell you. With reading and writing, I can write it down. I can send it to you. You can hang on to it. You can read it again. You can read it again. You can read it again. When you feel like it, you can respond to me. You can edit your response. The value of reading and writing and the development of language and relationship would be impossible to overstate. How many of you have ever asked a small child, what do you want to be when you grow up? Right? It's a fun question. We've all asked. I don't have any grandchildren yet, but I got two that are real close. And I'm looking forward to the day, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it's really fun to ask young children, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because they can say anything they want, right? was talking to some friends recently, and they asked their granddaughter, she was 7 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? She said, I want to be a mermaid. And they said, that's nice. I asked a 5-year-old one time what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said he was torn between a cowboy and an astronaut, and decided he was going to be the first cowboy astronaut. He had never ridden a horse. He lives in the city. I asked a 7-year-old what he wanted to be one time. He said he wanted to be a professional basketball player. He wanted to be LeBron James. I didn't have the heart to tell him that job's taken. You can't be LeBron James. And just confidentially between all of you and I, if you can be the worst 7-year-old basketball player in the world, he was. But it didn't matter because he was 7 years old. At 7 years old, way over here, you can imagine the world to be anything you want. You can dream of anything you want, and it all seems possible. And then you practice life for all those years. You do things. You practice life for all those years. And that question means something different when you're 5 than when you're 15. Because after practicing life for all those years, you get to early adolescence and something happens. If you remember one thing from this presentation, this is how many of you have teenagers? Yes, God bless you all. I have 3 children well beyond those years. For all the attention that the emotions get and the physical changes get and the sexuality get, for all the attention all of that gets, for all the attention to the growth spurt and the fact that they start to smell bad and all that kind of stuff, for all the attention that gets, it pales in comparison to the really dramatic change that occurs in adolescence. In early adolescence, following a spurt of dramatic brain development, children develop a newfound ability to think in deep and important ways about their future. And here's the thing that goes with it. They have to think about their future realistically and in a way that fits their past. People may still ask you at 13 or 14 years old, so what do you want to be when you grow up? But that's a different question. You can't say mermaid anymore. You can't say cowboy astronaut anymore. And if you're the last guy picked in every basketball game, you can't say professional basketball player with a straight face. But here's what's really important, is not other people asking you that question. What's really important about that is you're asking yourself that question. Early in adolescence, children spend an enormous amount of time and energy contemplating where they're going to end up in the world. And they base where they're going to end up in the world on what they see back behind them in their own lives. They stand there at 13 or 14 years old in the quiet of their own mind, and they look back over their life, and they look into their own future, and they look back over their own life, and they look into their future, and they have to imagine what all that is going to look like based on what I've seen back here. And if what you see back here is pretty good, and you have a sense of safety, and you have a sense of security, and you've had successful relationships, and you've done pretty well with language, and by now, that means reading. Because if we go to a first grade classroom, if you go halfway through the year, between the semesters in a first grade classroom, anywhere in the world, and you ask the children, who's the smartest 3 children in your class? This study's been done, by the way. Everybody will name more or less the same few kids. And how will they decide who they are? Who reads the best out loud? And if you're not that child, if you know you cannot read, if you know you are different than other children, if you're like my son, and when the teacher says, what's the first sound in the word, and you have no idea what the first sound in the word is, and nobody's there to help you, and you see everybody else in the room figuring out what that is, this is one of the things you have to look back on at 13, 14, 15 years old. What do I have leading up to this point that I can use? What have I collected in my life? What wonder, what skills, what abilities? What am I good at? And what can I make out of that for the future? Now, that's not so trivial as to say, what do you think you're going to be when you grow up? If somebody had asked me at 13 or 14 years old, what do you think you're going to be when you grow up? And they probably did. I would not have said a psychologist. I didn't know what the hell a psychologist was. Most of us are doing jobs that we didn't know existed when we were 13 or 14 years old. They maybe didn't exist when we were 13 or 14 years old. The real answer you have to be able to give isn't exactly what you're going to do, but I'm not sure, but I think it's going to be okay. Imagine the dread. Imagine the horror that ensues if you're 13, 14, 15 years old. You look back on your life and you imagine your future. You look back on your life and you imagine your future. And the only reasonable answer you can come up with is, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure it's going to stink. I have no real reason to believe that my life is going to be very good. For children like that, having the ability to read, having a few decent relationships can make a saving difference in their life. If you know you can do those things, it gives you some confidence the future may not be as bad. Story number 2. Long time ago, I don't do this now, long time ago I worked traditional inpatient psychiatry for kids and adolescents. One day I came into work and a kid had been admitted, and I could see on the board he had been assigned to me, and I went to see him. Other people there knew him. He had been admitted previously. He had a very difficult life. He'd been very badly traumatized as a child. He had been raised in a cult. One of his siblings or half-siblings, I've never been sure which, had died when something went wrong in the cult, and in the aftermath of that, all the other children were taken away, and he was placed in foster care. He was not considered adoptable because he was so filled with rage and was considered to be so dangerous. I saw him at the age of 12. He wasn't a really big kid. I saw him at the age of 12. His rage had gotten better. He had developed more control over himself. And a 14-year-old kid, much bigger than him at school, had been teasing him one day. And he was doing a really good job of ignoring that kid until it all went too far in the cafeteria. Then he jumped up, knocked the kid to the ground. Witnesses said it was no more than 10 or 12 seconds before adults got there and pulled him off of the other kid. In that time, he broke all the bones in that child's face, and the kid had to have repeated surgeries. So he got admitted to the hospital because he had had this episode of rage. And I got to know him pretty well. One day I was pretty new then. One day we were in a room playing billiards, pocket billiards, pool. And I missed, and I turned around and told him it was his turn to shoot. And as I turned around, the butt end of a pool cue whizzed by my nose. Like I could feel the wind, and I didn't flinch because I didn't have time. And I didn't know what to do, and he was between me and the door, and he had this pool cue wound up. I looked at him and I said, with all the skill of a new therapist, "Your shot." A few months later, he asked me, "How did you know I wasn't going to hit you with the pool cue?" And I said, "I didn't know you weren't going to hit me with the pool cue. I just couldn't figure out how to get out of the room." Slowly over time, we built a pretty good relationship. And while he spoke very few words, he was good with words. He could read well. He was intelligent. He was in agonizing pain, but he was intelligent. What I found out from him over some very painful and difficult therapy through everything that happened, he was 12 years old, was the only thing he was sure he wanted to do with the rest of his life. There was one thing he knew he wanted to do with the rest of his life, one thing. He wanted to, his parents' parental rights had been terminated. He wanted to find his parents. It was the only thing he knew for sure he wanted to do. He wanted to find his parents, and he wanted to kill them. He was absolutely certain about it to the point that we didn't talk about it anymore because there was nothing you could say to him to convince him to do anything else. I lost track of him. He went someplace else. He went to a treatment center, and I heard he had gone on to some foster homes that were going a little better than they had in the past. 3 years later, I was downstairs in our detention center interviewing a kid, and there was a glass window, and I saw a group of boys walk by, and there he was. He was very easy to recognize. He had some physical features that made him easy to pick out in a crowd. If he was here now, I could pick him out. He'd be close to 40, I could pick him out. I saw him walk by the window, and I stuck my head out, and he looked, and he saw me, and we made eye contact. I came back the next day and lied and said I had a court order to evaluate him, just so I could get him in a room and see how he was doing. And he came in to talk to me, and I said, "Do you remember me?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "What happened? Why are you here?" And he looked at me cold as ice, and he said, "I found my parents." I thought, shit. And I ran through my head as fast as I could. I knew what lawyer I would try to get to represent him. I knew what professionals we would get to testify on his behalf. The goal would be we would keep him in children's court. That would limit his sentence to run no longer than his 25th birthday. That would be fine. We would make sure everybody knew about the horrible trauma and abuse he had experienced, the things that had happened to him and his brothers and sisters. That's what we would do. And he proceeded to tell me about the whole thing. And I said, "So you found him. Tell me what happened." He had been out in his neighborhood, which had just, by dumb luck, his foster parents had lived in the same neighborhood as where his biological parents were living. And he stumbled across them one day, saw them, watched them, saw what house he went to. And one night, in the middle of the night, he gathered up his few belongings in the world, walked away from his foster home, and walked to their house, knocked on the door, where they welcomed him in with open arms, like the prodigal son returning, because they had no idea why he was there. And he stayed with them for a couple of weeks, and he learned their patterns and what they did, and he searched the house for things he could use to kill them. And one night as they laid in bed, sleeping, probably drunk, he went to the kitchen and got the biggest kitchen knife, the one he had picked out, and he paced around their bed, trying to decide. And he explained this to me very clearly, because he was very good with language. He explained to me very clearly what he was going to do and how he had to decide. His mother was small, and he could stab her first, and he was very confident he could kill her very easily. But if he woke his father up, his father was a large, powerful man. He wasn't sure if he could kill his father after he had killed his mother if his father woke up. So then he thought about stabbing his father first, and he said it would take more shots, it would take more wounds to kill his father. And while he was doing that, surely his mother would wake up. And the phone was on her side of the bed, and she could get to the phone, call 911. He wasn't sure if he could get to her and kill her before she called 911. And he paced around the bed. He described to me thinking about this the whole time. And I said, "So what did you do?" He said, "I put the knife back, and I walked 3 blocks away to the District 4 police station, and I turned myself in." And that's why he was in detention, because there was a warrant out for him as a missing person. And I asked him, "Why didn't you do it? Your whole life, the one thing you knew," it seems safe now to bring it up. Your whole life, the only thing you wanted to do was kill your parents, and you had your chance. Why didn't you do it? He said, "Well, I thought about it, and I realized that if I did it, there would be 8 people that I would disappoint." That in his whole life he had accumulated 8 people that if he killed them, he would disappoint them. He proceeded to name his child psychiatrist, Dr. Dennis Kozel, 6 teachers, who I dare say had no idea they ever would have made his list, because he was a hard kid to get along with. And he named me. And if I live a long time, and I hope to, nobody's ever going to pay me a higher compliment than I didn't kill somebody because of you. The power of relationships to save children cannot be overstated. But the power of language and reading is nearly as powerful. So where can we intervene? Most kids begin with adequate safety and security. Some are damaged by trauma. Most kids begin with adequate safety and security, though oftentimes that safety and security may be damaged later by trauma. It may be weakened, but it's still there. So the only thing we can do is try to reduce trauma and build resilience. But how do we build resilience? Relationships can be difficult to promote directly. If you're not good at relationships, it's hard for me to make you good at relationships. If you don't have any children in the neighborhood you can be friends with, it's hard to make friends for you. How many of you are teachers? How many of you know children who don't make friends well? How many of you think you have a really good surefire plan to help them with that? It's really, really difficult. It's really, really difficult. The one thing I want to say about relationships is quality is far more important than quantity. One of the things that worries me about relationships is in the age of social media, I know a lot of kids who have 500 friends and no close friends. They have 500 friends that they engage with in 7 and 8 and 11 word blurbs, but very few friends that they share deeply with in extensive language. But language can be directly influenced. Language can be directly influenced and has direct and indirect benefits for relationships and resilience. And we have a vast infrastructure already in place called schools. Schools, teachers, libraries, families. We have an enormous infrastructure already in place that allows us to influence a child's experience with language and reading. They have a chance to have... How many of you know children who struggle with relationships with people in the flesh, but seem to have very rich relationships with people in books? These are powerful things for children. We also need to offer wonder, magic, and success. Well, the ability to read and write and express ourselves and use language and make friends is one form of success. We also need to offer children an opportunity for other forms of success. One of the worst things I see, and we do it more to boys than to girls, is we see a child who's struggling in some part of their life, and so we identify the one thing they love and are successful at, and then we withhold it from them as a punishment because they aren't successful in the part of their life we want them to be successful in. The only thing the child really loves and cares about is basketball, so I tell him he can't be on the team unless he does better at something else. I was sitting in a house with a child who I had seen a number of times, and there was a meeting of his treatment team going on downstairs. I was upstairs in his room where he was playing video games, and I was watching him play video games. And he had a headset on. He was talking to people in 3 different countries. He was encouraging them in the way they played. He was being a good teammate as they played a game which was designed to kill as many of the enemy as possible, and they played it in an entirely unique way. They ran off to a corner of the map, and all they tried to do was see if working together they could climb a building which the game designers never intended anybody to climb. And so they would stand on top of each other, they would throw a grenade at the ground, and when it blew up they would jump and see if the blast would launch one of them onto the roof. He was enormously encouraging. Downstairs, the rest of his team were talking about how much they wanted to limit his video game play, how much of it they planned to take away from him. They had never watched him play video games. Nobody had ever just sat with him and watched him play and seen what made it important to him. Children need things at which they can be successful, and they won't always be the things that we choose for them. When we ask a child who struggles with reading to sit with us for extra time, to devote extra energy and extra emotion to the task of reading, we need to balance that out with enough time doing the things they love and which are good and natural for them, that they have the resilience and the energy to do the things we're asking them to do. And the other thing we need to do is let them know that we know this is hard for them. We're not doing it because it's hard for them. I talk to children all the time who see their admittedly unskilled reading lessons as a form of punishment, that people have figured out what I'm bad at and they're just trying to make me do it. We need to acknowledge, we need to explain things to them. Of the literally hundreds of kids I've seen in the course of my work who struggle to read, none of them had ever been told that the reason they struggled to read were because of these minor, small differences in their brain that they share with lots of other people, and that's why we're doing what we're doing, to try to help them with that. I have a million metaphors for that. It's an amazing thing to see an angry, stressed, traumatized child who also struggles to read. Let me touch them very gently at a few spots on the left side of their head. I don't get the spots right. That's not what matters. I touch them at a few spots on their head and say, there's just a few areas in there that aren't quite doing what we need them to do. And all of these lessons we want you to do are to try to get those areas of your brain, not you, those areas of your brain, to work a little harder, to play a little nicer with the other areas of the brain, and to get a little bit better at it. And then it's nice because you can ask them, do you know children who aren't always as good at everything else as other people? This is just one thing that you're struggling with. The intervention model then puts language at the bottom and makes language the essential thing. Exposing children to language, filling their lives with language. I have a friend who points out that probably what we need to do for these children is surround them with people who narrate their life. I'm walking across the stage now. I'm pointing the clicker. Gee, that's a blue mug. I wonder whose that is. But surround their world with language. Build that language into relationships. Provide them with a sense of safety and security through all of this, and give them a chance to experience wonder, magic, success. I said this last time I bought a lottery ticket, if I had won the $1.6 billion, I was going to open a school. And one of the things we were going to do for poor kids, every class was going to take a field trip every week. We're going to go to museums and art museums and zoos. You know, one of the things I always feel that's sad, I said that at a local school in Milwaukee. I said, you need to take more field trips. There's not that many places to go, they said. I said, go back. Go to the zoo again. Go to the museum again. You read the same damn book to them 4 times a day for a week. You can't go to the zoo twice in a year? God. They can read Frog and Toad till they're like going to die. But we can only go to the museum once in their entire elementary school career. We need to give them chances to be successful. We need to value the things that they're good at. They know what they're bad at. We need to value the things that they're good at and give them a chance to accumulate these things in the context of relationships, safety, security, and language. So that when they arrive at this critical moment, they can look back on their life and believe that they have a future which is more likely to be good than to be bad. A good friend of mine is Donald Meichenbaum. Does anybody know who Don Meichenbaum is? Don Meichenbaum is the developer of something called cognitive behavioral therapy. You've all heard probably of cognitive behavioral therapy. The 20th century was called the century of mental health. At the end of that century, a panel of people named the 10 most important people in the century of mental health. He was one of the 10 people, along with people like B.F. Skinner and Sigmund Freud. He was different in the sense that he was still alive. He said at a conference I was at, the single most important thing you can do for a young child who's experienced trauma, the best thing to do for them is teach them to read. And the reason he said that is because if your life has been terrible, if your life has been unspeakably bad, and you arrive at school with all of that trailing behind you, and then on top of it you can't read, you're screwed. But if you can read, if you can start to accumulate some success, if you can start to see yourself in that way, then over time you may overcome the trauma. Reading is the great vaccine. Reading and learning to learn well builds and extends language, develops and repairs the brain, builds the default network, fosters resilience, benefits everyone, and harms no one. It improves the odds for every good thing by both building that bucket and helping to fill it with outstanding experiences. And I'm going to tell you a story now, my last story. I came onto the unit years ago, and waiting for me was an 8-year-old girl who had been plucked from the worst torture in hell that you can possibly imagine. I will not give you nightmares by telling you what her life had been like. Suffice it to say, she was 8 years old. She had never attended to school. She had never attended school because she was too valuable to her mother to keep her home. And yet, at 8 years old, she could read beautifully. And over the course of working with her, I became fascinated by the fact that she could read so well. She read like a 12 or 15-year-old. She was gifted. And one of the reasons for that, obviously, is that she was born with one of these brains that are unusually given to reading. Don't make any mistake about it. That was her first lucky thing. She was also born with something else. She was born with a brother who was 2 years older than her. And while she was not allowed to go to school, he was. From the time he started school, every day he came home, and when he got locked in the same room with her where she had been all day, he spent his time teaching her everything he had learned at school that day. That little girl struggles with relationships. She's well into her 30s now. Struggles with relationships. Will never be married or have a permanent, close, intimate relationship. She decided for herself a long time ago that she will never and should never have children. But she is gainfully employed. She has a top security clearance from the United States military. She is a good neighbor and a good friend and a good co-worker and a voracious reader. Because she was lucky enough to learn how to read. Most of our children don't have brains like hers, and very few of them have a 10-year-old brother who's going to come back and teach them what nobody else did. That's why we have to do it. So my last thing I want to beg all of you of. When your children are hungry, or they're cold, and they don't have coats, and they don't have enough to eat, when their clothes don't fit, when they don't have shoes, I can't tell you not to notice all that. But don't forget that there are other people to take care of those things. There are other systems that take care of those things. If we don't teach those children to read, there's nobody else to do that. The children I see every day, the children I see who have been tortured and abused and locked in rooms, the last thing we can give them is this chance to recover. And their chance to recover requires that they learn to read. I haven't seen any children recover from that kind of abuse who couldn't read. But I have seen many recover in part because they could have some academic success, they could read, they could find a world in books, they could substitute those relationships for relationships they weren't ready to have yet. And in learning to read and be successful at school, they develop a relationship with teachers and adults and others that make a saving difference in their lives. How many of you are teachers? You save lives. Children you don't know get through the day, get through the year, get through their life because of you. And the most important thing you can do is teach them to read. I want to thank you for doing that. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for making the effort and helping other people to make the effort. A friend of mine said one time, he worked for the FBI, he said, 5% of the world is evil, 5% of the world stands in the way of that evil, and 90% of the world has no idea it's going on. If you teach children to read, you are among the 5% who stand in the way of that evil, even if you don't know it. I thank you for all you do. I thank you for being here. I hope you have a nice couple of days. I have exactly 90 seconds to answer all your questions. Seriously, if anybody has any questions, if you want to ask them now, if you want to wander up here, if you want to talk to me a little bit on the side, that's fine. I don't know who owns that. It's not mine. Thank you all.